Welcome to a quick summary of the EU Council meeting yesterday, which I know a lot of my friends ended up stuck in the Council until I think 4 in the morning, waiting for this to come through. So, did great work. But as you may have seen, I just put out an analysis piece for paid subscribers, which you may be interested in reading, that goes a bit more into depth into what we're going to talk about today. But for now, we saw quite a few things come out not only yesterday during the meeting itself, but in the last week as people were preparing for this meeting, because not only was the Mercosur agreement signature diplomatic scrambling postponed to mid-January, but we saw the European Union Council members finally come to some sort of agreement of how we're going to help fund the Ukrainian war effort for the next couple of years. I'll get to that in a few minutes because I want to go through a few of the less important things for the start, but still important, of course. I mean, the topic of the Middle East, for example, I didn't cover this in my paid article, was very much a weird one because it was very fluffy language without any real cohesive and concrete activity behind it. Basically, the council repeated the same things they've been saying about the Palestine situation yet again, calling for immediate, unimpeded, and sustained distribution of humanitarian aid, the need to allow UN and UN agencies to work independently and bring aid towards the people who are suffering in the region, and stating that the EU is going to continue engaging with all of the partners in the area. It's very basic things. It's very simple language. It's things that we've become accustomed to and we've heard many times before that tend to not really manifest in much until the member states decide to just force things through. Now, there was something very, very interesting that come through, though, is that the EU leaders all came out and strongly condemned the increase in settler violence against Palestinians. Now, this is something that's quite important because whatever side you land on the discussion of Israel-Palestine, you have to admit that there's been a massive increase in settlers attacking Palestinians, removing them from their homes, from their villages, from their towns, and that nothing is really being done to stop them. Now, the European Union has been quite active in actually implementing sanctions against these extreme settlers who are engaged in extreme violence and in some cases actively killing innocent individuals just to steal their homes, which is completely unacceptable. And it's right that the Council is engaging in this. And aside from this, there were calls for de-escalation within Lebanon, the need to preserve Lebanon's stability and to move past these episodes of violence and these instabilities that we're seeing ongoing, linked to the ongoing unrest and the ongoing instability caused by the Hamas-Israel war, the carnage in Palestine, etc., etc. And of course, they reiterated that they're supporting the peaceful and inclusive transition in Syria under the new leadership, now that Assad's been removed and he's currently playing Call of Duty on his own in some penthouse in Moscow. And in the Middle East, it was a repetition of everything that we've seen so far. It was a repetition of the things that we keep hearing, and it's a repetition of what's already been said many, many, many times. And admittedly, this was never going to be a huge aspect of the council this week, purely because of the sheer severity of the other issues on hand, notably Mercosur, notably Ukraine, notably Russia. Aside from that, the European leaders were talking about defense and security. And it's important to note that everything in this discussion is linked in some way, shape, or form to the multi-annual financial framework for 2028 to 2034, which is the EU's 7-year budget, which actually funds everything that's going on, decides who gets what, and decides what's actually being paid for and by who and for what. Now, the EU has decided, aside from decrying this very mean and evil Russian and Belarusian hybrid campaign against Europe, where there's cyber attacks, hybrid attacks, attempts to force the migrants that Russia and Belarus are bringing into Europe, to force them through borders to create instability in Europe, weaponizing these poor people looking for a better life. And even in some cases, according to what I've been reading recently in some analysis, actually helping them to tunnel under borders, which is the most devious way of actually abusing these poor people. The European leaders took stock of the progress and decided that the EU is on track to be at a sufficient defense readiness to deal with these risks and these threats and these attacks against its own security by 2030. And this is a combination of individual member states' preparations, uh, coalitions of various capable member states are able to work together, and also engaging in priority areas where they're able to actually launch projects, develop capacities, develop industrial capacity, develop the ability to create weaponry. And most importantly, there was obviously a welcoming of Canada getting involved in the SAFE program, which is a 150 billion funding program for European defense readiness and various partners, which includes Canada, which Japan has applied for as of a few days ago, which Turkey is attempting to apply for, and which the UK has wanted to apply for and has sort of stumbled through because, oh, it's a bit too expensive, we don't want to pay that much, we want it to be cheaper. Bref. And they're also working on the so-called defense readiness omnibus, as well as the military mobility planning. Now, these are two very important dossiers that are going to be very key in ensuring that Europeans can actually defend themselves if Russia completely loses the plot and tries to invade Estonia or Poland, which is suicidal, but they can do what they want. So, on the military mobility topic, the important part of this is that there have been various plannings and various analyses being made when it comes to the ability of member state military forces to actually traverse the European Union. And this has shown that a lot of what we had during the Cold War, a lot of the infrastructure that was put in place by member states to actually enable rapid disembarkation of material, of manpower, of equipment, of vehicles, of heavy duty weaponry, etc., isn't quite possible as it stands now. This is anything from bridges not being able to handle the weight of a tank or a self-propelled artillery unit, or certain vehicles used for rapid infantry or mobilized infantry or what have you, from highways that can no longer actually sustain a regular landing and takeoff regime of certain aircraft that would be able to bring emergency equipment to places in, for example, the east of Germany or in Poland or whatever, purely because the bridges are too close together, because the guardrails on the side are too tight, they can't be removed, or the tarmac is simply too soft to be able to handle that kind of weight. Not just in the summer when it's a bit more malleable, when it struggles with your SUV or your trucks or whatever, but even during the winter because they simply do not have the infrastructure within the concrete to actually maintain this. And a lot of this military mobility or these military mobility proposals is that they simply have to find a way of actually shoring up these issues, finding the relevant fields where they can create military bases for temporary periods of time to actually take up positions, or to actually enable member states to allow their military to transfer through member states without having to wait at the border for several hours because a member state is rightly mildly concerned when you've got 7,000 French tanks rolling through your countryside. You know, it's understandable, it makes sense, but at time of war, when NATO has to mobilize within the space of, I think, I've seen between 8 and 12 hours to be able to actively defend the Eastern Front against a potential Russian invasion or against a potential Russian attack, or to reinforce certain regions of Europe when there's been an initial attack. The initial defensive forces have been mobilized. They've blunted certain attacks, but they're feeling the strain of the invasion, the high pace of warfare, bombardments, and this kind of thing. So the European Union is going to continue to work on this. And the member states are continuing to work towards what many are calling a kind of military Schengen, where the idea is to bring the ability of militaries to cross borders within several hours rather than 8 to 12. Now, aside from that, the Defense Readiness Omnibus is similar to lots of the general omnibuy that are going through the union, which are about reducing red tape, allowing member states to produce more of whatever they need, and ensuring that certain factors from a normal industrial situation don't simply break down. Now, speaking from personal experience, for example, I once worked in an industry related to paints, coatings, marine coatings, and this kind of thing, which meant that, a lot of the legislation I was working on was about how do you maintain safe levels of certain unsafe chemicals within things such as the coating on your ships or the coatings on your trucks, or in some cases, the coatings on a box of munitions within the European Union. And this was a very odd one as someone who's got a more geopolitical background, because I worked on a dossier when it came to the labeling of a product. And while I wasn't working on specifically the military equipment, it took a very long time for the member states and the parliament and the council and the commission to come to some kind of decision that they could exempt military equipment packaging from labeling requirements according to EU industrial law. And this is very odd because when you think about it, a military just needs bullets. It needs shells, it needs gas for its trucks, it needs medkits, it needs sutures, it needs bandages, it needs whatever a military needs to not get themselves killed, to be the most effective in combat, and to actually be able to engage enemies that we need to engage to do this right. Yet, this legislation, up until some late stage of the discussion itself, rendered, I think, most of the military equipment illegal unless they went through some kind of delegated act to fix that after that had gone into effect. Same thing for the coatings. There were some discussions that I was aware of, that I was engaged in, which, while I wasn't focused on the military aspect, certain coatings used on certain military equipment were going to be rendered illegal according to EU law because the member states did not think about the need to ensure that the military aspect of this coating was not going to be hammered in some way, shape, or form. And so a lot of the work in the military omnibus or the security omnibus, whatever they're calling it now, is going to come down to a lot of the streamlining of the red tape to enable these member states to actually produce certain equipments in a more effective manner, or to remove the limits on certain member states potentially using more dangerous chemicals in order for them to be able to increase the rate of production for example, in France, the César cannons in Saint-Étienne, artillery shells up in the north, bullets that are necessary for our weapons to actually fire in the Massif Central, and all of these kind of aspects, because in many cases they have been curtailed by legislation which was written with the best of intentions, but doesn't necessarily actively enable a wartime state to be able to actually come through, survive, and fight effectively. Now, aside from that, so look, this is still on the smaller end of the topics that we're looking at here. So the MFF for 28 to 34, the EU leaders took note of the negotiating box. They're expecting an agreement before the end of 2026 to adopt legislative acts in 27, which would allow the EU funding to come through. That's something we'll cover at a later time because I have to admit the MFF, it's a very complicated discussion. Things change quite frequently. It's not as simple as a lot of people on social media make it sound. And to be honest, I would rather do it right than bring it to you guys now, half-baked and a bit messy. So we'll get to that later on. And aside from that, the enlargement and the related reforms, the EU, again, they reiterated what they've been saying all this time, that there needs to be a continued reform effort through all of this, that the EU needs to lay necessary groundwork and reforms from their side to facilitate an enlargement and the integration of these potential member states. And also, they've discussed the fact that there's been progress on the former immigration discussions, that the Council conclusions on the Pact for the Mediterranean are acceptable, broadly speaking, for them, and that they work on democratic resilience is ongoing, that they need to keep tackling disinformation, foreign information manipulation, and protecting free and pluralistic media. Now, for those of you who have followed me for the last couple of weeks and seen the shit show I found myself in with the Americans, you know that's not really working very well, and to be honest, they probably should try a little harder. And I mean, I could talk about this for hours, just because we're not doing enough to tackle disinformation. Information manipulation is a complete and utter mess, and to be honest, nothing that we're actually doing is actually having an effect. Nothing that we're doing is actually stopping anybody from doing what they're doing anyway. And quite frankly, I don't really know what's going as far as saying that we're going to reaffirm the EU's regulatory autonomy in the digital sphere really does. I mean, I don't want to sound a bit too sarky, but to be honest, guys, bref, So there were also some points on of reaction to the recent American security. I forgot the name of this thing. The security declaration made by Trump's admin a few months ago about the fact that we've been bad boys. We're not really following the US far right law of survival that they're putting out. The EU wants to peel away, I think it was Poland, Hungary, and Italy from the Union, which, good luck with that. They're all fairly dependent on EU funding. And it was very much von der Leyen stating, okay, Callas stating that, foreign states do not have a say in European affairs, that the European Union affairs will be handled by the European member states, and that will continue to see the Americans as some kind of partnership or an ally. Typical diplomatic language, wasn't very major, but bref. Now that we've cleared all of the small stuff, let's talk Ukraine. So this has been a very messy council. This has been a very messy council for several reasons. Now, first of all, the topic of using the frozen Russian funds is never going to be an easy one. It was never going to be an easy one. But on top of that, we're operating in an environment where you've got several member states, notably Hungary, Slovakia, Czechia, who lean pro-Russian, so block a lot of the efforts that can be made on that aspect, and who have currently been quite resistant when it comes to funding Ukraine in any way. Not only that, but we have a nationalist slash conservative slash partially secessionist leader in Belgium under the guise of Wever, who put his foot down and made a big argument against actually using these frozen funds because of the risk it put Belgium in, who have several trade and bilateral cooperation agreements with Russia, which means that there are many member states, of course, including some French companies that really shouldn't be active over there anymore and should be stopped. There are many Belgian companies that are active in Russia. And on top of this, Russia preemptively launched a legal proceeding against Belgium for the use of these funds. Now, on top of this, there were also threats that were directly made to Wever and Belgium by the Kremlin. This was covered by, I think it was the Washington Post, who quoted Wever directly. Euromaidan Press covered it as well, I believe. and several others. And all of this had the effect that Belgium was, whether you believe them or the lawyers who said that it's very unlikely they get sued, rightly or wrongly, there was pressure on Belgium. Belgium didn't want to risk being held to a financial repayment on their own that was larger than the entire Belgian economy. Now, look, I'm going to maybe be a bit simplistic on this point, but it's understandable that they feel this way. It's understandable that with the risks that we were seeing, that were being made, that the legal counsel in favor of the repatriation of Russian funds to reconstruct Ukraine and fund Ukraine were positive, were negative, etc., etc. The simple fact is that the EU Council wasn't able to find an agreement that worked for this. Now, we know that the unholy trinity of Hungary, Czechia, and Slovakia would never back Belgium on this, and this needs to be noted. They would never support Belgium if Belgium tried to fight against this and got sued. They would never support Belgium. It would never happen, which would have left another 24 member states or 23 member states, excluding Belgium, to support them. And unfortunately, not enough of them made the arguments that they would. Now, the sticking point on this was very much that they didn't feel comfortable giving completely open contributions to any potential support for Belgium, which I believe, again, is understandable, but is very unfair when you're pushing Belgium to do this. But also, we have to take into account the fact that Belgium benefits enormously purely from having all of the European Union institutions, all of the European agencies, all of the workers related to the European Union, and all of the lobbyists who come here very frequently, the regular transport coming to Belgium, the business coming to Belgium because they need to have offices near the institutions, etc., etc. All of this to say that the use of frozen Belgian or frozen Russian funding was not put through, simply because no one could assuage Belgian fears, and also because there were 3 member states who were never going to agree to this anyway. Now, this didn't stop the council from making sure that the Russian funds remain frozen indefinitely in European territory, no matter what happens. The war in Ukraine could end tomorrow. Russia's not seeing that money for a while. And the idea behind this step taken by the council, and I've seen a few EU experts in the audience here, so, please feel free to jump in whenever you want. I'll read out your comments or read out any questions anybody may have. The idea behind this is that everybody sends the commission off to find some kind of way of dealing with this, to find some legal backing and legal standing to protect whoever gets involved in this mess, and allows the council more time to try to assuage the fears of the various actors involved. Now, technically, Russia can still sue Euroclear for illegally withholding their funds, whatever. The problem with that argument, and admittedly, I'm not a legal expert on this topic, but I know that this has been done in the past. Great powers across history, and including recently, have frozen these kind of funds over and over again. Russia has done this without any legal backlash. The US has done this constantly for the last 40, 50 years, I believe. The British have done it. The French have done it. We have done this over and over and over and over again. Which is what leads many to question what is actually freaking out Bada Weber so much that he is blocking this so aggressively. Many people believe it could be these threats made against him by the Kremlin. Many people believe it could just be that he doesn't really believe that Ukraine can win, so he doesn't want to back a losing side. And in this domain, he's even said as much that he doesn't see Ukraine winning. And that he has said that, I can't remember the exact quote, but Ukraine has to come to terms with the reality of the war, which is basically trying to create the language around a managed surrender by European powers that Ukraine could live with or Ukraine would be willing to accept. Ignoring the fact that Vladimir Putin has already said that he's going to push as far as he can until he's actually gotten his victory, until he's achieved his strategic goals, and until Russia holds arguably most of Ukraine. Bref. And this led to the decision by the European member states to continue the funding of Ukraine over the period of 2026 to 2027 to the tune of about 90 billion. Now, this is a loan, and it was only achieved due to the suggestion, and to their credit, this isn't the worst solution to the impasse, by Viktor Orban's Hungary, by Czechia and Slovakia, using Article 20 of the Treaty on the European Union to trigger enhanced cooperation, meaning that you've got 24 member states that are guaranteeing this loan through borrowing on capital markets, and this should cover everything. Now, there are several arguments for and against this in general. Now, the argument in favor is that, as Donald Tusk said yesterday morning or the day before, I can't remember exactly the timeline, that at this stage it's not a case of, it's not possible to let Ukraine just deal with this on their own. That what has to be done is that the European Union has to actually help Ukraine to survive, or the war will end up coming to our steps. And in the direct quote I have in mind is that it's either money today or blood tomorrow, which is entirely true because the Americans have completely abandoned Ukraine. And Donald Trump, as he desperately seeks some kind of... Sorry, my cat is currently jumping up and down the wall like an unhinged lunatic. Cool. And basically, if we don't support Ukraine now, if we don't actually make sure that Ukraine can survive in some way, shape, or form as a military power that can resist against Russia and fight Russia to a stalemate, or push Russia to the point where it has to find some kind of ceasefire and peace agreement, preferably in Ukraine's favor, but war is war, then European lives will have to be spent to stop this. And we've seen this in the press regularly. I've covered this in the French Dispatch, that the French chief of staff of the armed forces has said outright that we have to start preparing for the fact that French lives and French children will have to go to war at some point if things continue as they do. We've seen British generals doing the same thing. We have the Americans aggressively arguing that it's going to be Europeans and nobody else, not the Americans, not Japanese, not Chinese, just Europeans fighting each other. And they're right. I mean, you can't see the carnage that we're seeing. You can't see a country like Russia that has gone into full mobilization of its economy, of its population, of the state itself, and then expect them to just stop after everything we've done to support Ukraine, how many Russian lives that has cost, how much Vladimir Putin's ego has been wounded, how many Russians have been told that Europe is the enemy, Europeans are coming to kill them and take their children, and Europeans are fighting against them in the fields of Kharkiv or near Crimea or what have you, right? You have a states and a population that are gradually being amped up by this kind of language. And again, there are also the topics we've discussed in the past, where you've got a lot of foreigners being dragged into Russia with financial incentives, fighting on behalf of Russia, or more impoverished segments of Russian society being dragged to the front with the promise of payments. We have a society right now that has gone into full mobilization towards war, and Putin has threatened us directly. Putin and the Russian military, they have war plans in the event of a war with NATO, with Poland, with Estonia, with Lithuania, with France, with whoever. They have their plans. They're very clearly willing to use it at this stage because they don't have anything to lose. And on top of that, the Americans aren't exactly coming to save us, and they're actively trying to, again, help Donald Trump win his cardboard cereal box peace prize by betraying Ukraine. So, coming to the title of this whole discussion, have the Europeans betrayed Ukraine in giving them 90 billion over several years, in attempting to continue pushing for some kind of managed end in Ukraine's favor, as we've seen in the discourse since last night? No, we haven't betrayed Ukraine. We're giving them 90 billion of loans while also continuing to provide military equipment on a regular basis. Now, there's a couple of question marks that we're seeing now and that a lot of people have raised. Most notably, the fact that the several council leaders came out recently, most notably Emmanuel Macron, the French president, saying that this loan will in part have to be spent on European equipment. There is a problem with that. Do we produce enough equipment to actually be able to equip the Ukrainians and force them to be spending X amount or X percentage of this loan on European equipment? Right now, we don't. And I don't think it's entirely fair to be pushing the Ukrainians into that pocket when we haven't even brought the industrial capacity to the front yet. Okay, so certain member states have. France are building new factories, we're increasing production lines, we're increasing the production of materiel, of vehicles, of what have you, and we're increasing the military exponentially. The problem is that those two things stop us from sending more to Ukraine, whether they're paying for it or not. Because when we have more reservists, when we have more soldiers, when we have more matelot, when we have more airmen who need to be equipped with equipment that will be used in the worst case scenario to fight against Russia, we can't give that equipment to Ukraine because it has to be in French hands. And if we don't have the equipment on hand to be able to train our soldiers or even equip them when they're in service or equip them when they're on deployments on the Eastern Front or what have you, there's a fundamental mismatch there with the industrial capacity and the industrial reality, as well as the reality of equipping an army while trying to support another to equip theirs. And this is a major problem I can see with this situation because we're not quite doing enough. I mean, sure, the safe funding is going to do some work to actually produce more equipment. I need to check what the actual specifics of the allocations are. Actually, to be honest, I'll check that now because there were project lists released not too long ago. But the reality is that yeah, I'll have to look at this another time and we'll do another live and we'll go through this maybe on Twitch or something. But the reality is that we don't necessarily know if, even if it's as small as 10% of these billions and billions in loans, there's a reality that we don't know if that there's going to be enough spare equipment to be able to be sold or equipped to the Ukrainians, if I'm making any sense at all on this. Not only that, there's another question that has been raised, and I think it's slightly unfair, but it's slightly justifiable considering the fact that this is public funding going to a war effort, is that many commentators, and not just those on the far right or the far left, just to be fair, but many people from centrist backgrounds or center left or center right, many people have questioned whether or not it's even possible for this to be repaid. Once again, I think this is a slightly unfair discussion to be had, purely because of the fact that my own belief in this is that any money that goes towards the Ukrainian war effort that potentially saves us from greater calamity later on down the line is a net positive. It's a net positive for Europe. It's a net positive for Ukraine, of course, because they get to continue to try to fight to survive. And on top of this, we're getting massive benefits out of this anyway. So, to put on my cynical cap right now, we're not only going to be effectively creating one of the biggest European military superpowers on the continent, who is single-handedly, admittedly with European and American help with the equipment side of things, but is effectively holding off a Russian advance that is from an army that was something like 3, 4, 5 times its size at the start. Right? The country is exponentially larger. They have exponentially larger military capacity, and yet Ukraine is fighting through. So not only are we keeping ourselves safe with the Ukrainian shield, but we're creating a superpower that will be joining the European Union. On top of this, another cynical aspect of this is that we're learning much more about military strategy and tactics employed by NATO that the Ukrainians are being trained up in, using modern Western equipment. And we're finding out just how effective it is when an outmatched force is fighting an enemy that's superior in industrial capacity and numbers. And we are seeing the advent of a new form of warfare involving drones, which is proving to be increasingly effective and is effectively reshaping the world of modern warfare as we see it today. Now, many people will say, yes, we should be spending this money on, fixing the homeless situation, which is the age-old fight that we hear, which nobody ever actually ends up spending money to fix. Or dealing with the more impoverished in society, which again, everybody says, but nobody ever does. And we've seen this in the US elections. We've seen this with far-right elections everywhere, blah, blah, blah. We even hear, why are we doing this when we're just antagonizing Russia, despite the fact that Russia has been launching cyber attacks against us and assassinating people on NATO territory for decades at this stage. And they didn't ask us for permission to assassinate people in Paris, but bref. And so all of this is to say that, despite the fact that there's criticisms of the fact that we're spending this money, it's a benefit in the long run. It helps to keep Ukraine active. And on top of this, it just allows us more breathing room while everybody figures out the situation with the repatriation of Russian funds. I'm just going through my notes again here. So another thing that came through is that there was once again the call for just and lasting peace, that the EU is going to continue to actively engage in peace efforts in Ukraine, and that the EU is going to continue to try to contribute to security guarantees for Ukraine. Now, this is probably my last point on this topic of the council. So if you guys have any questions, if you guys have any comments you want to make, just throw them down now, because otherwise I'm going to go run off and eat my own weight in Pandoro in about 10, 15 minutes. The reality right now, and I think that this is something that needs to be repeated again, is that the US security strategy is one of the biggest problems that we have right now as European geopoliticians in general. And I mean, I've seen Dave's in the audience here. Dave, we should do a Substack live on that absolute calamity of a dossier. But the reality is that we're dealing with an ally that's not really an ally of ours anymore, that is actively attacking our strategies for ensuring that the world doesn't catch fire. We all end up dying in trenches in the next 20 years. And is actively attempting to decimate any form of normative or market power that the EU could potentially have, maintain, or engage in. You're seeing this through the way that the US is attacking regulatory frameworks in Europe, the fact that they're, again, trying to peel away member states from the European Union to create the favorite project of the far right, which is this Europe of nations, not this union of Europeans. And again, working with an enemy that has said outright that they don't want most of our leaders to be in place. Putin has said that he wants to see the leaders who have moved against him to be removed. He wants to continue his imperialist rampage across Europe, and unfortunately, while many people don't like that, that is simply the case. That is simply the goal that Putin has, and unfortunately, Donald Trump and Donald Trump's allies, considering the fact that Donald Trump doesn't seem to actually be all that mentally capable or intellectually capable or surviving very well the stress of his second mandate, this is one of the big risks that we're facing. And right now, Europe is stuck in between a rock and a hard place. We are being squeezed by Russia. We're being squeezed by the USA. We're being preyed upon by China, who see an opportunity to get another half ally and do what they can. And this is problematic because it's leading to Europe and Ukraine being forced out of the discussions when it comes to the peace deal between Ukraine and Russia. Now, there are certain guardrails that will help Europe to weigh in on this anyway. Most notably, the fact that the Ukrainians ultimately have to agree to one of these ceasefire agreements or peace deals. And Ukraine isn't necessarily going to do that if it's going to be caught with its pants down. Likewise, even when Russia finds some kind of peace deal that the Americans like and the Americans push for it, and then Ukraine says, you know what, we can live with this if we change this, Russia immediately rejects the whole thing. Russia says, actually, this doesn't work for us, no thanks. We didn't work on this, no thanks. This isn't in our interests, no thanks. Because they believe they can win a war of attrition. And I think this is one of the most difficult things for the Europeans to handle and deal with. And this will have been a discussion during the council meeting last night for sure, is that a lot of what we discussed today and a lot of what is in that paid article I wrote earlier is that the Europeans need to urgently create an industrial base and a military base and a financial base that allows them to stand a bit taller, stand stronger, keep the back stiff, stand up to the bullies. Because realistically, if we developed our industries, if we kept actually building up what we have, if we kept being if we want to keep being the beacon of European security and beacon of European diplomacy and normativity and what have you, we need to be able to throw down. There's no other way of saying this. When you've got bullies in the room, you don't really get away with saying please and thank you. And right now, that's really what we're doing. Not helped by the massive corruption scandals that we're seeing over at the College of Europe and the EEAS. And the reality is that until we develop our industry, until we increase our military, until we have an astronomically strong reserve, until we have a huge military industrial complex, we're not really going to be taken seriously in these kind of aspects. We're going to get lucky, I think. And I should say that we're going to get lucky on this topic purely because of the fact that Ukraine can say no. And Russia will keep saying no as they play for time and stall Donald Trump, who will keep running on his hamster wheel, saying, oh, we can find a peace deal. Oh, Putin loves me. Oh, I love Putin. No, no, no. Putin will keep running him through. Putin will keep saying no. Putin will keep pushing to be able to win this war through military means so he doesn't have to give anything up. And if Ukraine can keep holding strong, if Europeans can keep Ukraine strong, if we can keep supporting Ukraine, then we can contribute to security guarantees, then we can be engaged in the peace efforts, then we can hopefully do something here. But it's a big if. And unfortunately, as I've said in several domains now, we did the bare minimum yesterday. We, as a union, really did the bare minimum. We are very lucky that Viktor Orban and the other leaders didn't shut everything down. We're very, very lucky that they didn't just veto every single thing that mattered or that occurred, because otherwise we would have come out with less than nothing. And while billion is positive, we're not really doing a great job to. Well, we're currently not replacing the money lost from the Americans. And this is going to be a big issue for the Ukrainians in general. And on top of that, I think we can get away with doing this here. Taking out a 90 billion loan on capital markets, which is backed by the European budget. We can maybe do it one or two more times. But the problem then becomes political. And we've got big elections coming up soon. We have municipal elections in France next year. We have the starts of the presidential elections in France. And right now, currently, it's looking like Jordan Bardella is going to come through. We have the AfD, who's coming out very strongly in Germany. If they start winning power, then Ukraine has some big issues. You have, then the Franco-German motor could become slightly more pro-Russian, which is quite problematic. You then have the issues of Spain not necessarily wanting to get involved too heavily in a lot of these rearmament aspects. We then have certain Scandinavian companies balking at some of the costs of a lot of this, even though the fact that they are one of the heavy contributors right now, at least when it comes to the public declarations and all this kind of thing. And so right now, this is why, despite the fact that people were talking about yesterday being one of the big, and I mean the big historic council meetings, we fell flat. We didn't come through what we needed to. We didn't achieve what we should have achieved. We were stopped. We were limited by our political structures. We were limited by the structures of the council. We were limited by European law. And also by the fact that, despite the fact that he faced down threats from gangs across Belgium when he was becoming aggressive up in Antwerp, related to drug trafficking and gang violence and this kind of stuff, we were stopped by Bart de Wever getting scared of Russia's threats and Russia's pressure on Belgium. And again, it was understandable. It's we can't fault the Wever for that, but it's going to have huge ramifications. And we'll have to see whether the commission can come through and actually convince him to do otherwise the next time the topic pops up. So, despite the fact that I promised a very short and brief breakdown of this whole council meeting, this went on for about 50 minutes. So thank you guys for tuning in. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you learned something. Hope I said something useful, quite honestly, because, it's always nice. And if you're not already subscribed to the French Dispatch, there's a button somewhere on the screen. Feel free to subscribe. Follow me on social media. Read my articles. Let me know what you think. And guys, while I was supposed to be on holiday already, there's always something that happens. So thank you for tuning in. Have a great weekend. Enjoy the Christmas break. And maybe see you guys before the New Year. Maybe not, but we'll see. Yeah, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and have a great end to your day.